at ya, back at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, back at ya. Tell you what's master.
All right, welcome to another episode of Cut the Bull. This is Wilfred Reilly, as always, leading off at bat. But right now, that gives me the luxury of talking with my co-panelists, Christy Kelly and Brooks Crenshaw, about the issues of the day. Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
All right, so let's jump into this for those that are jumping on to Cut the Bull right now. This is Robert Cherry, emeritus professor at, do you say CUNY? How do you do the abbreviations?
I just say Brooklyn College.
Brooklyn College, boom. One of many great educational institutions in New York City. So the reason we wanted to have Robert or Dr. Cherry on today is that he's written what I understand to be one of the very few kind of upcoming, fairly major press books that talks about population diversity in Israel. And obviously there's a lot of focus on that, on the Jewish state, ongoing war. There's been an ongoing war with the neighbors since 1948, some would say. But Israel also is about 20% Arab Israeli in terms of population. Bob, I'll just pass the ball to you. What's the upcoming book about? What's the demographic situation like in Israel?
Well, the demographic is pretty broad. Within the Jewish population, about 40% are descendants from Arab countries called Mizrahi Jews. About 10% are from Ethiopia. About 30% are from European backgrounds. So, the Jewish ethnicity is itself pretty broad. But the book I wrote is about this 20% that you mentioned, the Arab citizens of Israel. They're not spoken about all that much. You hear about what's going on in, obviously Gaza, the West Bank, but what happens with this 2 million population in Israel is pretty unknown to people. And for a variety of personal reasons, I got involved with this community about 20 years ago. And over time, I began writing more and more about it, particularly as their circumstances really dramatically improved over this period. So that's what the book is about. It starts in the end of the 19th century when Jewish immigration from Europe began, and the complexity of integrating into an Arab land at the time. There's some interesting things about that, but that's where the book starts, and it goes through yesterday.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I probably have a question later about how Jewish populations interact, because Israel, I pulled this up on my side tablet here, is technically one of the most racially diverse countries in the world. I actually was unaware of that. They're just all of Jewish heritage or Jewish religion, I suppose. But in terms of the Israeli Arab community, I guess the question would be, this is my probably last question on this thread before we flip over to Brooks or Christy, but if Israel's a country, and I'm pro-Israeli, but I don't spend a great deal of time focusing on Israeli internal politics. If Israel's a country where 40% of the Jews come from Arab states and they consider themselves Arab in population terms, others from Ethiopia, population's 20% Arab, Muslim, so on. What's the argument that Israel is an apartheid state or a racially conflicted state? Does that just refer to Gaza and the West Bank, or what are we
Well,
talking
it's tricky. It often, the examples that are given are from the West Bank, the occupied area, and not from Israel. The only thing that people say about Israel is that about 6 or 7 years ago, there was officially passed a resolution through the Knesset that Israel is a Jewish state. And people have used that resolution to say Arabs are second-class citizens. The problem is, if you actually look at what that resolution meant, it just verified that Jews from anywhere in the world can automatically, if they choose, migrate to Israel and become a citizen. And Arabs can't do that. I mean, look, there are, I don't know, maybe 5 million plus Arabs in refugee camps and elsewhere who are descendants of the 700,000 that fled Israel in 1948. Very few of those descendants are alive, but their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren are counted as refugees. They can't go back to Israel. So clearly there's a bias there. There's a bias in marriage. If you're a Jew in Israel and you marry a non-Jew who's not from Israel, no problem. She or he can come to Israel. But if you're an Arab citizen and you want to marry an Arab from the West Bank, Lebanon, or someone, it's tricky. You don't automatically have it. So there certainly are national symbols are only Jewish. So there certainly are Jewish priorities. But again, if you look at how people in Israel are treated, forgetting about who could get there, who can't, but how people in Israel are treated, I would say that there's more equality, more fairness than certainly Palestinian refugees have in Lebanon and Jordan or wherever else they've gone. And there's more fairness for Arabs than in most of Western Europe. Israeli Arabs, those who are citizens, have more rights and have been able to progress much more than Arabs living in France, for example.
Yeah, interesting. And actually, I'll move over to Brooks Crenshaw, but I want to clarify one thing you said very briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you said that the term Palestinian refugee, and I've heard this before in my academic role, but there's a technical meaning there. Like a Palestinian refugee is a descendant of anyone who left the current state of Israel during these long ago wars. Is that accurate? If your great grandfather was from Palestine, you're a Palestinian refugee?
Yep, that's where these 5 to 7 million so-called refugees. There's a special UN has one refugee organization solely dedicated to the Palestinian situation. And it's, in some ways, it's bizarre because after the Second World War, there was a lot of transfer of people around. Germans were shipped out of what is now the Ukraine back to Germany. Part of Germany was put into Poland. Poles had to move from here to there. Hindus and Muslims, when India was broken up, moved around, and in all these cases, the people who became refugees integrated themselves into the new society. And the interesting thing about the Palestinian situation, at the time of the 1948 war, there was virtually no Palestinian movement. The movement at that time, to the extent there was a political movement, was pan-Arabism. The idea that there was the unity of all the Arabs in that region. With that consciousness, if these refugees were moved to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, why didn't they just integrate? That's what pan-Arabism was. But no, they couldn't, because it would undermine the continued fight to destroy Israel as a Jewish state.
Right. And I could talk about this for a while as an international relations guy. I mean, like almost the creation of the refugee idea in the modern sense, especially in Palestine and maybe the 60s, 70s, because I mean the entire idea throughout all of history. I'm part Native American, but I mean if you lost a war and it was reasonably honorable conflict on both sides, it was very, very common to move. We've now defined a lot of that as ethnic cleansing. We seem to have prevented it. I mean, most Western countries are discussing some kind of right of return. Should we give the lands to the people that once occupied them? And Bob, I'm sure you'll have a lot of opinions on those takes, but I've spent about 15 minutes talking now. So Brooks Crenshaw, I don't know. Christy might have some passionate questions here, but Brooks Crenshaw, you've spent an extensive amount of time in this region of the world. Thanks for your service. You're in the Middle East. You know,
Iraq
what's
and
your take
Afghanistan.
on this? Have you been to Israel? What are your thoughts on the politics involved here? What's your take?
I have yet to go to Israel. I spent most of my time in the Anbar Desert in Iraq. I spent a little bit of time in Afghanistan, but you know, with regard to the Israel Gaza situation, and in general, I think that the Western media and Western left political side of things has gotten things very wrong. And, with regard to Israeli demography, and Bob, this is kind of what you're talking about. When we look at what I would consider the Hamas aligned American left, in light of Keir Starmer and the new Canadian Prime Minister now threatening UN recognition of Palestinian state, two-party state to pressure Israel. Most of those protesters and most of those leftists in the U.S., when you look at Gaza and you look at Israel, the demography that looks most like what they describe as a utopia, which is ethnic and racial diversity, gay rights, women's rights, like that's Israel. So how did this get reverted? How did this get turned backwards? What did we get wrong in the West with regard to that dynamic?
Well, part of it is it's two-pronged. One is not really understanding the Jewish diversity itself and how much of its origins are non-Western. So that when you get Ta-Nehisi Coates claiming that Israel is a white supremacist country, it's laughable. And the other thing, which is what my book is really about, is looking at how in the last, it has this long history, and there's real warts, particularly around the end of the 48 war in the first decade of Israel. There's some really dark policies that the Zionist leadership had towards the Arabs, coming very close to a Jim Crow kind of setup. But in the last 20 years, there has been an incredible transformation where Arabs have really been integrated substantially into the full fabric of the country in the highest reaches. They've been on the Supreme Court. They've been part of a ruling government. 30% of the doctors are Israeli Arab citizens. Nazareth is an important high-tech hub where many international companies are setting up satellites there. It's just ridiculous to think about Israel in the way the left tries to characterize it. Again, now there's still significant inequalities, but there are inequalities between the Mizrahi Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews. Indeed, for a long time, the situation in the Mizrahi Jews was pretty similar to the Arab population. In fact, for a brief period in the 80s, there was a unity between the two groups. The Mizrahi Jews formed the Black Panther Party, and they united with the Arab party for a few years. So, there's a complex history here that really exposes certain deep ignorance among the critics of Israel.
Yeah, that's and again, like, unrequested interlude from me before we move to another panelist. But this seems to be a problem in global politics in general, where people take situations from the USA or the UK, powerful states, and they try to apply them around the world where they just don't make any sense. So, I mean, as I understand, just from talking with executives at 23andMe, I mean, we had Hunter Ash and people like that on the show. There's virtually no genetic difference between, say, a Mizrahi Jew and an Arab. Like, the idea that one of these people is white and the other one isn't, or something like that, or like some Jewish guy with slightly curly hair calling himself a Black Panther. It seems to be just an absurd ritualistic ripoff of our culture. And I really am puzzled by why other civilized states keep doing this. Last comment, but I mean, I remember watching the Black Lives Matter march in Stockholm, Sweden. I don't know if any of the rest of you saw this. There was another one in Lagos, Nigeria, where, like, I think you guys won, But I mean, there were all these Swedish kids just walking, like, throwing stones, and the idea was we have to stop the oppression of blacks in Sweden. But other than this former Somali upper class, there aren't any. So this is just a weird pattern. But Christy, do you ever talk about this, or?
Yeah, no, this is definitely something you don't hear a lot about. And the immediate thought that comes to mind is after the October 7th attack by Hamas, did you hear of stories or what happened? I mean, I know, like, after 9/11 here, there were Muslims who felt, different types of incidents happen because of 9/11. So did the Arab citizens there, have they suffered any? Have they taken steps backwards since the attack? Are they blamed for the attacks? Like, what's happening there?
That's an interesting question. It's the next to last chapter of my book is about this. It ended up that there were a couple of things right after the October 7th where, maybe 100 Arab students and academic types were interviewed, and some were briefly arrested for posts they had put on some place that looked like they were implicitly supporting Hamas. But that was very brief and by and large inconsequential to anyone, any Arab. But what happened was the Arab community showed very strong unity with the Jewish community. That if you looked at polls 2 months after the war started, they blamed Hamas much more for the devastation to the people in Gaza than they blamed the IDF. I mean, part of it was that, 40 or 50 Arab citizens were killed by Hamas when they invaded. But more of it was just they understood the viciousness of that invasion on October 7th. But what happened is polls began to consistently show that Arabs began to feel more a part of the Israeli state. Dramatic increase in the percentages that said they feel that they're part of Israel. An interesting and important thing that happened is in 2021, when there was the last Gaza war, there was physical violence between Jews and Arabs in a number of what are called the mixed cities. Haifa and Jaffa and Lod. I mean, there were a couple of large cities that have a pretty integrated population. And there were violent confrontations in a number of them. Not that did not happen in one city after this war started. And part of it was that imams and rabbis got together and formed joint groups, and they strongly discouraged youth from even thinking about getting involved in violence. And they had group events and a whole bunch of things dramatically different than what had happened 2 years earlier. So, now certainly you have this really fascist right wing as part of Netanyahu's coalition. These revisionist Zionists, or religious Zionists, they call themselves. They have been given almost a free hand in the West Bank, where there is a lot of violence going on. But in Israel, their attempts to make problems has been forestalled. And before I stop, let me give one important example. In the last 10 years, there have been 2 5-year plans that have been passed by the Knesset to dramatically improve the situation of Arab citizens in their communities. The last one was passed in 2022. What these right-wing fascists tried to do, because they were on committees, they tried to withhold funds from that had been legislated for doing these things. They were pushed back by members of the ruling coalition, particularly this Mizrahi party, Shas, where they not only pushed back, but they legislated even more money than had been in the 5-year plan to help in this current situation. They also initiated a substantial funding bill for East Jerusalem to improve the situation there. So yes, you have this dangerous right wing, but there's been a pushback by them, not only by the populace, but also by a lot of people in Netanyahu's ruling coalition.
Interesting. All right. So in-depth question and response there from Christy and Bob. So I guess my question might be a little simpler, although it actually ties into this. I mean, a lot of this conversation has centered on how Arab citizens of Israel seem to feel pretty Israeli by this point. One of the few pieces of kind of viewer feedback that I got as we were discussing our upcoming list of guests was the question, do Arab Israelis want to leave? Like, do they want to move to the surrounding Arab countries? What's your take on that? I mean, I would assume the answer is
well, there's a very concrete issue, and that is East Jerusalem. Right. East Jerusalem is officially, by the world, considered part of the West Bank and the Palestinian area, and anticipated to be the capital of a Palestinian state. For a long time, there was essentially benign neglect towards that area by the Jewish state, because after all, it was going to become part of the two-state solution. But once that became clear this two-state solution isn't coming, there was a dramatic change in the attitude. And so there have been consistent funding. There's industrial parks, but one of the things that was done is the educational system in East Jerusalem followed the Jordanian system, because that's what was in the West Bank before Israel took it over in 1967. And the Palestinians demanded. The problem with that curriculum, it didn't prepare people for Israeli university system. So over time, the East Jerusalem Palestinians wanted their kids to go to college, right? So they began having after school programs and get around it. Finally, Israel was allowed to change the curriculum to the Israeli system. And there was like an increase over a 5-year period of where like 50 kids would be at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It went up to 700. So that polls have been taken of people in East Jerusalem. Would they rather be part of a Palestinian state or be in Israel? And the plurality wants to be in Israel.
Yeah, that's so. I mean, that's a quick and definite response there. I'm not, as a somewhat cynical person, all that shocked by that. I mean, we see a lot of dramatic virtue signaling from different groups, including blacks, whites, whatnot. But I mean, I would suppose that very few people in America are interested in going back to Ghana, Sicily, the north of Ireland. And similarly, if you're a Arab guy and you live in the Israeli portion of Jerusalem, whatever noise you might make, I don't think you're moving to the Gaza Strip. But so that's fascinating that there is data there. A follow-up to that, Israeli Arabs in some fields are now outperforming Israeli Jews, correct? So you mentioned 30%.
Well,
of all
I
the
meant in
professors-
medicine. In medicine and high tech, at Technion University, which is the MIT of Israel, more than 20% of the students who get in and who graduate are Arab citizens. So that's their percentage in the population, about 20%. So, that's not true at MIT or at Caltech for blacks, right?
Oh, it's true for Asians. I mean, it's probably true for Arabs in the United States. I mean, if
They
you look
don't
at
count.
are there
You can't talk about Asians.
no, but I mean, I bet you, if you were to look at MIT and ask, is the population more than 4% Arab and Jewish? Yeah, I mean, by leaps and bounds. But no,
okay.
that's
Anyway, but
interesting.
that's an example of their performance. Now, a lot of it had to do, not a lot, but a significant amount had to do with very strong affirmative action but the affirmative action was very much like the affirmative action in the military to get into West Point. The affirmative action was preparatory. They didn't change the standards to get into West Point. They didn't change the standards to get into Technion, but they had strong preparatory programs to beef up the skills of of Arab citizens and to beef up the skills of Black candidates for West Point. So that's, developmental affirmative action is a winner.
Yeah, well, Brooks, that's right in your wheelhouse. I actually have two questions, but one first, what's your take on kind of the military's methodology on race relations? Because when I look at military units by performance, everyone seems pretty much within some narrow bands. I mean, there's a slight white performance advantage.
Well, what I was referring to was what happened in the late 90s when, the lesson of Vietnam was you can't have a white officer corps and people of color as enlisted people. You needed to find a way to have a Black officer corps. Now what's happened since then, that was 25 years ago. I don't know, but that's what was done.
I'm largely, well, I don't know if I'm entirely agreeing with that. Affirmative action is a contested subject, but every time I look at the military, they seem to have some of the best race relations outcomes in the country.
No, that's right.
Yeah, but Brooks, as a military man, a former military man, do you agree with that? What's the military doing right, doing wrong? And also, Bob in passing said, a two-state solution, that's probably not going to happen. Is that your take as well as somebody who's looked at the region?
Well, so first, the military side, I think the American military has certainly properly integrated all backgrounds into a mission-driven, cohesive unit. I think
Exactly.
I think probably the best of times was probably in the early 2000s. This was before a lot of the social experimentation and the critical theory based curricula and initiatives got introduced. And those, when they get introduced, they don't get introduced into the foxhole. They get introduced to the units that are the least combat relevant. And so that creates this disparity between
Mm.
the warfighter and the cake eater, and so I will say that, from my experience, you saw some regional and racial, what would you say, differentiation early on, say post boot camp, maybe while you're doing your MOS training, but they do a very good job of incorporating people from what a lot of the units do, in particular the Marine Corps. They break you down and then they rebuild you. And so you are rebuilt as a Marine, and there is a light green Marine and a dark green Marine, and that's the only difference. And so that's an example where the Marine Corps did that very well. I tend to believe that the more combat driven units don't require the social engineering because there is a combined interest with regard to safety and with regard to combat effectiveness. And so a lot of the, a lot of what those social initiatives seek to address isn't typically a non-issue. I would say in this day and age, it may have been an issue before my time in the military, and I can't speak to that, but in my experience, it was the most effective integration regimen I've seen to date. The other question, two-state solution. Yeah. So I've got this meme that I love, and it's, the strong men create good times, good times create weak men create hard times. The meme is strong men create war in the Middle East, good times create war in the Middle East, weak men create war in the Middle East, hard times create war in the Middle East. There will always be conflict. A two-state solution, a one-state solution.
Well, let me comment on this.
Please.
I think one of the least understood reasons why the two-state solution wasn't adopted in the 1990s when
Rabin was
had a chance, and certainly not now, is what's called a right of return.
Yeah.
You have these 5 million people sitting in refugee camps around, and one of the reasons that they haven't been integrated into the societies, in fact, in my book, I talk a little bit about Jordan, where there's about 1 million stateless Palestinians. There are about 1 million who are the ones who are from the West Bank who moved there. They have Jordanian citizenship. But the ones who have their origins from Gaza or from Kuwait, where 350,000 Palestinians were expelled after the Iraqi war because Yasser Arafat decided to back Hussein and not the Kuwaitis. They just kicked out every Palestinian, 350,000. I mean, that was ethnic cleansing. And they went to.
If we're gonna jump
No,
in
but
very
let
briefly,
me get in.
like just as a comment, isn't one reason for that the Palestinian displaced population's been kind of troublesome?
No, that's not. There is a little bit of that, but the main reason in Jordan now that these stateless Palestinians who lead really deplorable lives is the following. There's a Human Rights Commission in Jordan, and they said we should do something about it. We should help these people, blah, blah, blah. And what they were told by the Palestinian leadership and the Jordanian leadership, if we help those people and we integrate them, it undermines the right of return. And that's the same thing in Lebanon, where if you want to see apartheid, go to Lebanon and see how how the Palestinian refugees are treated. They're required to live only in their camps. They can't get any decent jobs. They can't buy land. They can't do anything. And it's only by keeping them impoverished can you keep alive this right of return. And that's what undermines the two-state solution. Until that right of return is dropped, and they can't drop it because you got all these poor, impoverished 3 generations living in these conditions. And what are you going to tell them if there's a two-state solution? You know, they're not moving to the West Bank. They could have moved there if they wanted to at some point. So, yeah. Okay.
No, these are all good and interesting summaries. I mean, you obviously know much more about the topic as the author than the panel does here. I mean, not to disparage my talented and lovely co-hosts, but or me. But anyway, getting to the point though, like one point that's running through the things that you're saying, if we're being blunt about it, would seem to be that the stable, fairly powerful Arab states like the idea of the Palestinians as a weapon against their rival Israel, one, and also two, there really have been problems with the Palestinian diaspora in that region. I mean, like when you said in passing, the reason for Kuwait, which is a stable, civilized country, expelling them was that the Palestinian population sided with Saddam Hussein during an unusually brutal invasion. That's really a core issue. You have this massive group of displaced people that are living in these other states that a lot of the surrounding powers don't want, like Egypt.
It's not clear that the Kuwaiti Palestinians supported Arafat did.
Right.
He had this bizarre view that Iraq would say to the Israelis, we'll get out of Kuwait if you get out of the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah.
It was bizarre.
So right of return is to Yasser Arafat was what American racism is to Al Sharpton, essentially. Like there is right. There's this Tom Sowell racism isn't dead, but it's on life support. It's being kept alive by those who are making a good living, making a do about it, and that's Arafat essentially to the point, I think.
Absolutely. Anyway. But like one thing here though, I'd really like to see the polling when you guys are saying, yeah, well, Arafat was crazy. I mean, Arafat's almost the stereotypical Arab terrorist. But when you guys are saying, well, he wanted this, we don't know about the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, when given a chance at a fully democratic election, and we're not talking here about
I'm talking about the Palestinian people in
Kuwait.
Yeah, but I basically I would like to see some polling on how they felt about that. I don't know if they were just innocent of their leader. But the Palestinians definitely won. I have some questions, as I just said, about their attitudes, but definitely have had some of the worst leadership in history, at least for those that didn't vote for these people, inflicted on them. I mean, you had Arafat, you've got Hamas now. So when you say, well, like the Palestine, why doesn't Gaza just surrender? The question is, who are the, I guess, stakeholders there? Who could make that move? Many of them are in Qatar, as I understand, so that's probably not going to happen. But for anyone on the panel, I mean, Bob summarized the issue very precisely. How would the Israeli-Palestinian Christy Kelly, I'm going to ask you this. How would the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, just as a small question, be resolved? If you were emperor in that region, what would you do about it? And do you think they'll do it, empress?
I mean, how it's going to be resolved is a loaded question, because if it were that easy, it would have already happened by now. And like we said, we don't think, a two-state solution is ever going to happen. But I don't remember if it was you or if it was Dr. Cherry that said, if they would have moved by now, if they wanted to move by now, they would have. I don't know if that is necessarily true. It doesn't seem like, there's that much flexibility for movement in that region.
Well, look, there was polls that about 50% of the Gazans would travel to Israel to get on planes and boats to go somewhere else if they could. They're not going to be allowed to leave. Countries are not going to, because again, this notion of ethnic cleansing, which in this case is a little bizarre because if supposedly they're refugees, then Gaza's not their home, their permanent home. They can move somewhere else, but they have to stay there because, the whole issue of the Nakba was never about displacement. For 40 years, it was about the catastrophe of there being a Jewish state on what was perceived to be Arab land. That's what Hamas believes. Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. That's what the Islamists have always believed, that Israel is illegitimate because these are Arab lands. And so, you have a kind of politics that just stands in the way of any serious ability to have a two-state solution. But what you can have is better administration in the West Bank and in Gaza, where the focus would be on economic and social development and not on war. Because after all, what did Hamas do? It took billions of dollars and built a network of tunnels the size of the London Underground. That's millions of dollars, billions of dollars of resources and manpower that could have gone to something constructive. And so my hope is that to the extent the West and the Arab nations give money to rebuild, it's going to be done in a constructive way. And if you had a period of about 7 years on the West Bank from 2006 to 2013, when you had a minister who was committed to economic development, and the West Bank was moving along in a positive way, but that's not what Fatah and Islamic Jihad wanted. And so they got rid of this guy who was minister. Hopefully, at the end of this war, the West and the Arab states will be much more disciplined in what they give their money for in those areas.
Yeah, that might almost be the final piece of the episode to some extent. I mean, there's a series of intractable underlying issues that could perhaps be best worked out by almost colonialism. I mean, external governance of some kind. But Brooks Crenshaw, you haven't yet given your piece on the two-state solution, or is any what's the resolution to some of these issues, like the right of return, et cetera? Is there one?
Well, so I tend to believe that tribal allegiance and intergenerational blood libel leaves only conflict as an option. And
Hatfields and McCoys.
Exactly. Yeah. And so as a Kentuckian, that's
why I mentioned it.
Right. That's certainly the story of Appalachia. It's funny. I was doing I was consulting for a manufacturer in Appalachia, and one of the guys that was working there was from that region, but he'd also served in Afghanistan. And when I got him alone, we were talking, and I was like, so how much like where you're from was Afghanistan for you? And he was like, it's the same place, man. It's the same place. Because all the tribal dynamics, all the, intergenerational feuds, like there is no talking out of that really long term. And so that's, I think, the problem. And in my naivete, I thought, when I first, post 9/11 went to deploy, and I thought I was going to go to Iraq and liberate the Iraqi people. And I was going to give them a thumb drive that had, Jeffersonian republicanism on it, and they were just going to adopt it and be free. Right. But it turns out that unless you organically go through those steps of ideas culturally to get to those solutions, it can't be transmuted interculturally. And so, what has occurred is that the Iraqis and other nations have used democracy as a streetcar to pick the next dictator. So that's the reason I don't think that there's a solution beyond the long game of organic arrival at the solutions that the West has had the good fortune to endeavor.
Boom. All right. Now we've been going for about 50 minutes talking to a great guest, Dr. Robert Cherry. We're each going to do our 20 seconds of wisdom now. I, perhaps the least wise panelist, am going to open. And then we're going to go around to Bob, who obviously is also going to note his book, publication date, that sort of thing. But my comment would be, actually, there was a resolution to the problems in the high mountains of Appalachia with the Hatfields and McCoys and so on. The U.S. government came in and killed a bunch of people. And that's the same thing that happened in Afghanistan. The place was relatively peaceful when we and even the damn Ruskies were in charge of it. So, I mean, to some extent, someone, this may be a collection of Arab powers, is probably going to have to put aside some of, forgive me, the crazy bullshit like the right of return for 7 million people that hate their new country, and actually work out some kind of reasonable negotiated government for that area. And that is how you get Singapore and Hong Kong. That's what happened to make them exist. The British, sparring with the Chinese, took control of those areas, built cities, and enforced the law. So that would be my take. Christy, what do you think?
I guess one thing I have is all of these, poor college students that are running around and screaming, from the river to the sea and, justice for, Palestine and just all of the stuff. They just really don't understand, I think, how complicated it is. And they certainly haven't heard, that, 20% of Arabs actually live in Israel. And it's certain things like that you don't hear, that you wish the media would get across, not just, that they're, starving children and the food isn't getting there, whether or not that's debatable. But these other stories that Dr. Cherry is going to bring out in his book, I think it's needed.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. I mean, it's a 2,000-year long, for longer than that, actually. If you go into the Old Testament, conflict going on. The people look very similar. It's very silly to take our post-Jim Crow politics and superimpose them over that. But Brooks, what do you think?
Well, so as a former military
Palestine.
man, I'll close with a commentary on the Gaza conflict. The problem with it's a very divisive issue, and the problem is that many people on both sides are telling the truth in some fashion. The problem is when you explore those truths and stack them in a priority, in a hierarchy of some truth. I think what is at the apex of that triangle, the most important truth is that Hamas's refined strategy of using human shields and civilian infrastructure cannot be allowed to be the new evolutionarily stable system. It can't be allowed to be the paramount tactic that works, because that incentivizes that tactic globally, and you incentivize more of it. So whatever means are required to defeat that tactic, that's the reason that I'm on the side that I'm on, is because I viewed that as the paramount truth in the stack. Somebody else might put some other truth up there. I don't see it.
Fair enough. And Dr. Robert Cherry, our guest today. Sir, what have you to say?
Buy my book when it comes out. It will come out this fall. It's titled Arab Citizens, How Far Have They Come? ? It's published by, some people might know, Encounter Books.
Yeah.
Well, they have a printing called Wicked Sun Press, which is sort of dedicated to Jewish related books. So that's why my book is there. If you want to see more of what I've written in essay form on this and other issues, you can go to muckrack.com, Robert/Cherry, and see my stuff. Wilfred, thank you for having me on. And have a good rest of the summer.
Thank you, Robert. Robert Cherry's a buddy of mine. We've seen each other at a bunch of different events and so on. He came on one of our older form podcasts with myself, Charles Love, and I think Christy Kelly. But good to have you back again, Doc. I will share that muckrack link on Twitter. Actually, there's some great long form essays on there. And when the book Jewish Citizens of Israel comes out, I will run this again. I certainly encourage people to go take a look at that. And remember that the world is a complex place that even the smartest people in it struggle to explain and understand. Your chanting and sloganeering and fighting other youth in the streets is not improving anything. All right. On that note, thank you, Bob.
Country to say, Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.